There was not convincing evidence that aspartame caused cancer, and also reaffirmed that there is an acceptable daily intake, which is 0 to 40 milligrams per kilogram of body weight. So just to put that into context, if you think about the average can of diet soft drink, that contains between 200 to 300 milligrams of aspartame per can.
Welcome back to the podcast series, The Sweet Taste of Balance. This is episode 3, The Effect of Non-Sugar Sweeteners on Cancer Risk. My name is Dr Idrees Mughal, and today I'm here with Dr Frankie Jackson-Spence.
Hi, thanks for having me.
How are you doing?
I'm good, how are you?
Great, fantastic. Before we dive into this juicy topic we have today, I know it's a very controversial one, just can you tell the audience a bit about what it is you do and what you do in your day-to-day work?
Absolutely. So I wear many hats, similar to you. Day to day, I am a clinical research fellow in oncology. I work in kidney and bladder cancer clinical trials, and that basically means I'm involved in drug development and conducting randomized clinical trials, and I'm currently studying for a PhD.
Oh, fantastic.
So that kind of aspect of my life is super academic. Kind of what ties in really nicely with that is, whilst I'm interested in drug development and improving outcomes for patients with cancer and improving their treatment options, I became really interested in kind of the lifestyle factors and the way we live that also influences our risk of developing diseases, including cancer. And that kind of led me to set up my educational platform, Dr Frankie, where I post evidence-based, science-backed health content that is kind of relatable and accessible to everyone. And I also host my own podcast, Vision of Health, which where I interview experts on similar things. So the two kind of tie in really nicely. We've got the prevention and the lifestyle aspect, and then I also have the more academic drug development side.
Amazing. Just quickly, what's the basis of the PhD you're doing?
So I am investigating kind of activity levels of patients on bladder cancer treatment. So all of my patients have been given a wearable device, and I'm tracking their activity levels and their step counts and seeing if that changes with different treatments and if it influences their outcomes.
Very interesting. Looking forward to seeing that in the future.
You.
So why don't we touch on, what happened across the media headlines last year. I know I myself was involved with, tackling some of these myths and, common perceptions out there. What can you tell us about what the WHO ruled when it comes to non-sugar sweeteners and what it means for the general public?
Yeah, absolutely. So if we take our minds back to kind of July 2023, so about a year ago, there was huge uproar and so many media headlines because the World Health Organization reclassified how we deem the risk of non-sugar sweeteners and their risk of cancer. So just to put some context to this, and I'll try and explain it in a straightforward way, essentially the World Health Organization works with different regulatory bodies and agencies who have groups of experts who assess all the publicly available scientific evidence that's available. So whether it be peer-reviewed journals, reports that are involved in kind of government policy decision-making, or any reports that are involved in regulatory approvals of things. They have groups of independent experts that assess that evidence and then come to conclusions about the risk of something. So there's two kind of agencies that are involved in this report on the non-sugar sweeteners, and we're advising the World Health Organization. The first is the IARC, which is the International Agency for Research on Cancer. And they're like the cancer agency within the World Health Organization.
Yeah.
So essentially, like I mentioned, they examine and have these group of experts that kind of collate and critically appraise all of the available evidence. And that is evidence on human subjects, on animals, and also kind of sciencey, mechanistic evidence. So looking at the way certain chemicals behave in different environments. So they classify that into the kind of hazard classification system, which is 4 groups. Group 1 would be that something is absolutely carcinogenic. So that means it definitely causes cancer. And that's well-known things like, tobacco smoke, UV rays from the sun. We've got alcohol, processed red meats. They're all things that we have enough and sufficient evidence to say that they directly can cause cancer in humans.
Yes, I think it's important to say might have the potential to cause cancer, right? Because obviously one cigarette in your lifetime's likely not going to do much, right? So,
Yeah, exactly. But there's sufficient evidence that those agents have directly been linked to
yes.
causing cancer in sufficient studies. We then have group 2A, which is that they are probably carcinogenic. So this is where there is sufficient evidence in experimental models on humans. So this is things like night shift work or things like red meat consumption. I know.
Yeah, terrible.
The next level would be level 2B, which is that it's a possible risk. And this actually means that there's limited or insufficient evidence in humans, or that there is kind of a discrepancy where there may be some evidence in lab models and animal models, but this doesn't translate to the human studies. And this is where aspartame is, aspartame. Are we saying it aspartame?
Aspartame?
Aspartame is linked and deemed classified. But also on this list of possibly carcinogenic, things like aloe vera, things we use to relieve sunburn. And then group B would be that it's not classified and that there's insufficient evidence to say it's a link with cancer. And the headlines came from the fact the World Health Organization shifted the classification of non-sugar sweeteners from the non-classified and insufficient evidence into that 2B category where there is a possible risk. Now, what I really want to caveat here is that this classification of hazard isn't your risk, it is the kind of available evidence.
Yeah.
And so it's not saying that the levels of risk, it's saying how much evidence is there to support that, because in the scientific community, we never use one study or one report. It is really that appraisal of the entire body of evidence.
Yeah, no, fantastic points. I think it's really important to make it clear. People look at these categories and, the words like probable, possible, they get scared, basically, right? And the fact that it's been moved from the, the bottom category to 2B, is it correct to say that if a agent or compound or ingredient is put into the non-classifiable category, right? Would you say it's correct to say that there could just be a lack of evidence where they can't decide or they can't evaluate correct or accurately which possible way, whether it's, potential or possible, carcinogen or not. I think people confuse that if it's put into the bottom category, then that automatically means it outright doesn't cause cancer.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to distinguish that that's not the case, right?
Yeah, exactly what I was saying about this isn't your levels of risk. It's not categorizing these agents into levels of risk. The group 3, meaning not classified, insufficient evidence, just means there isn't evidence to kind of say either way. And so it doesn't mean necessarily there's no risk. It means there's no published evidence available to assess that risk, and so the evidence would be insufficient in that sense. And I think that is an important point to make.
Yeah, no, fantastic. So, okay, so now that we've kind of dissected the individual groups on a technical basis, what does this mean for the average consumer?
So following on from kind of how the World Health Organization classifies these ingredients and, publishes this data, there is also another agency that was involved in this. So this is the, hopefully I get this correct, the Joint Expert Committee on Food Additives. And they're another agency that work with the World Health Organization. And they also independently, but kind of synergistically with IARC, conducted their independent review. And they deemed that there were, the evidence surrounding aspartame was not convincing for being a risk factor for cancer, and also deemed that there was not convincing evidence that aspartame caused cancer, and also reaffirmed that there is an acceptable daily intake, which is 0 to 40 milligrams per kilogram of body weight. So just to put that into context, if you think about the average can of diet soft drink, that contains between 200 to 300 milligrams of aspartame per can. If you think an average adult is 70 kilograms, that would be the equivalent of drinking 9 to 14 cans per day of a soft drink and still being within the acceptable daily intake levels of non-sugar sweeteners which are deemed safe. And that level of exposure is much higher than we would be consuming these products. So it does also show that whilst IARC said, it's possibly carcinogenic, we then have to look at what this other regulatory body said and said, yes, but we also still have an acceptable daily intake where at levels lower than that it's deemed safe.
Yeah, I think, just making it clear that the IARC they don't really assess dosage. It's not really their, it's not their wheelhouse to talk about what amounts can qualify for what risks, right? Whereas JECFA, the shorter name for the Joint Expert Committee, they're actually telling the average consumer what this means in terms of exposure to the average person, right? So 9 to 14, I mean, that's every day for the foreseeable future, for years and years, to have any kind of, increased risk of anything, right? So, yeah, so I think a great distinction here is to discuss the fact that IARC don't really take into account dosage, whereas JECFA are telling the average consumer, okay, what this means in real world terms is, you would need to be having 9 to 14 for an average adult weighing 70 kilograms, 9 to 14 cans of diet drink every single day for the foreseeable future. And that really puts things back into perspective, that actually you shouldn't, be overly concerned or have a kind of anxiety induced reaction to hearing these kind of things. So that's a really interesting insight.
And what I think is, is important touching on that about having the anxiety around it. Lots of the headlines came from single studies. So, you can go onto Google or go onto even an academic search engine like PubMed, and you can find an article that will claim a certain agent causes cancer. But that's not how we do things. We need to assess the entire evidence base. And that's where I think there's a real risk between qualified people who can actually appraise the evidence and people who pick one study and believe it to be true, because that's not how we do things, is it? You will also similarly find articles that say there's no risk. So I think that's really important. A journalist at a big newspaper or magazine is going to just do the random Google. They're not going to be doing a full meta-analysis, critical appraisal.
Yes, well, it's a bit of confirmation bias, isn't it? We love it. If whatever your preconceived beliefs or views are, people tend to just, find the evidence that affirms their belief and disregard any evidence that goes against it. So, yeah, fantastic point about we need to remain objective to the best of our ability and, go to these expert independent committees. That is literally their job to assess and evaluate the evidence base, right? So, yeah, great. So you mentioned acceptable daily intake earlier. Can you just explain a little bit about what that means and kind of how they come to that conclusion? Because I think that's quite important for the average person.
So essentially, acceptable daily intake is assessing risk based on the dosage. So if you were to analyse the evidence, any risk that's been shown in any studies is at certain levels. So, risk isn't equal. If you have a very small amount of something versus a large amount of something, the risk is going to change. And so these independent bodies assess what is your safe dose. And it's like with anything, moderation is important, and we can't forget that. Something on its own may not be a risk, but if you have too much of it, then the risk may develop. And so acceptable daily intake is used for anything we consume, really, any additive or ingredient. And like I mentioned, the range that's deemed acceptable is between 0 and 40 milligrams per kilogram of body weight. So actually a really large amount, and much larger than what we would be consuming in a normal diet. I think with anything, when we're talking about our lifestyle risk factors, you need to put this into context, because there's lots of things that we may deem healthy that we consume, that if you have too much of one thing, it becomes unhealthy. And I think an important point here when we're talking about diet is, if you have too much of one thing, it doesn't leave room in your diet for other things. So if you're consuming lots of food items which contain non-sugar sweeteners kind of out of moderation, they are typically foods that have been processed in some way, and many of them are ultra-processed foods. And what that means is not necessarily that you're consuming a high amount of that product and that being the risk. The risk may also come from the fact that you are having less of the good nutritious stuff. Exactly. If you're eating lots of, pre-prepared packaged foods, you're probably not eating as much home-cooked whole foods in their whole raw form and eating enough plants and things like that. And so it's, what do you not get enough of as a result of that?
Fantastic point. When people ask me, Dr. Idrees, is this healthy? Is that healthy? People tend to forget that, you have to talk about something you're comparing it to. Like, for example, something I covered recently, cheese. Like, is cheese healthy? Well, you have to look at, if you're eating the cheese, what are you no longer eating? What are you substituting out of the diet, right? So, compared to, trans and saturated fatty fried foods, yeah, cheese is very healthy, right? And then, compared to minimally processed legumes or soybeans, perhaps it's, slightly less protective for cardiovascular health.
Yeah.
So,
and this is the point, isn't it? Because we need to look at our diet as a whole.
yes.
And I would really encourage people to look at what they're eating across the whole week. If you're having the odd diet soft drink that contains non-sugar sweeteners amongst a diet that is rich in whole foods, has a wide variety of plants, 30 plants a week, with, few processed foods in there, then that's really kind of a drop in the ocean. But if it's something where it's, it is your replacement for water, and you're having it with every meal, every single day across your whole life, that's where we have that acceptable daily intake starts to blur the lines. And I think one issue we have here with these non-sugar sweeteners is that I think some people think because they don't contain calories that they're kind of free foods. And of course, the only thing they add to our diet, they don't contain much nutritional value, but they do add taste. And so if we're just thinking from a hydration perspective, water's always going to be superior. And I think it's important that just because something doesn't have calories, we still consume it in moderation. But that doesn't mean that if you're having that drink amongst someone who eats loads of plants and loads of homemade foods, that it's going to be bad for you. And I think we take things out of context.
Yeah, I'm not going to lie. I think, I rarely have just plain water myself. I love a, little artificially sweetened squash to my water. So yeah, I think
but what does the rest of your diet look like?
Yeah, exactly. The overarching point is, what is the totality of your dietary pattern? Is it amongst many healthful individual habits that are obviously going to be very protective for you? So yeah, that's a fantastic point. Where do you see, just to kind of finish off, where do you see the main utility or the main use and the main use within a dietary pattern of ultra-processed foods? Can we just deem all ultra-processed foods as we need to, rid them from our diets? Where can you see there being inclusion into a healthful dietary pattern?
That's a great question. I think the entire kind of topic of nutrition and health is extremely complex. I think that there's 2 points to this. The first is that we have known risk factors for cancer and other diseases. And I think we need to focus on the risk factors that we can change that actually have evidence behind them. So that's the first thing. When it comes to our diet and these kind of foods like ultra-processed foods, I think we have a spectrum, and we have foods that are really highly nutritious and they're really kind of nutritionally valuable. And that's your whole foods, your plants that are rich in polyphenols, those bright coloured fruits and vegetables, or like you said, legumes, seeds, nuts. Those foods are really high, they have really high nutritional value. Then we have foods that may be processed in some way, so minimally processed. So we have things like chickpeas, they come in a can, they are minimally processed, but they still have nutritional value. And then we have foods that become less nutritious. And these are things where they, have these additives, they may be processed in some way, and they have a place because we are not robots and they have taste. And I think, we have to look at foods on a spectrum. I think having that education is important because there will be people out there, and perhaps people listening to this episode, where they will consume those kind of low calorie products thinking they are healthier. And they aren't necessarily healthier. They have a place amongst a balanced diet, and I think that's important. It's not a substitute, it's just another food item that's kind of maybe less nutritious on the scale. So I think ultra processed foods can have a place. Of course, we can eat for taste, we can eat for enjoyment, but they shouldn't necessarily be seen to be healthier than something that is more whole. And I see this a lot in kind of the fitness industry. I'm also a qualified personal trainer, and I'll see clients picking something like a protein bar because it's easier to track, and they find the prospect of eating a banana frightening because they don't really know what's in it. We know that the way food is digested is different. So if you were to eat
Yes.
nuts in their whole form, the way it's digested and metabolized and the nutrients you get from it is different than if you process that nut. You know, you grind it into a powder, you make it into a nut butter. It's different, and it can have an effect on our body. And I think we need more education on that rather than just focusing on what we're taking out of our diet and seeing these
Yeah.
lower calorie foods as healthier. It's not all about calories.
About the nut butter, there's an interesting study I cited actually recently. The energy harvesting from the exact same nuts, of almonds versus almond butter, is almost double. Like you extract almost double the amount of calories from the nut butter, right? And people don't, you can't take these things into account if you're just looking at a food label.
Yeah.
And also, obviously, the nut butter is going to be far less satiating than the actual almond itself, right?
But it's the same as fruit versus fruit juice. You know,
Yeah,
the
yeah,
food
yeah.
matrix is important.
Yes.
How food is has an effect on how we
The
digest
form
it.
of the food. Yeah.
Exactly, the form of the food. And I think that's what we lack with ultra processed foods. I also think as well, ultra processed foods tend to lack dietary fiber, which
Yes.
keeps us full for longer, but also has got its own protective things. The average daily intake of dietary fiber, I think in the UK is 18 grams per day, and we're supposed to consume 30 grams per day.
Is it 18?
Yeah, well, that's the average. We're supposed to consume 30 grams per day. And I think, you know, dietary fiber has also been shown to be protective against things like type 2 diabetes, heart disease,
Oh, yeah.
colorectal cancer.
Yeah.
And so that again is kind of highlighting, is the ultra processed food itself bad,
Yes.
or is it that it lacks some of the things that whole foods have?
Yeah, great point for lots of people to ponder and to perhaps not be scared of having convenience, having, affordable, accessible foods, and just to, try and focus on including more healthful options, which could then over time start to displace some of these more unhealthful options, right? So yeah, great point. And also, I think it's important to understand how the ADI is actually derived, right? So if you look from rodent trials, what's typically done is they take the level that was seen to start to cause harm in rodents, right? So we call this the non-observable adverse effect level, or the NOEL, as they say in the literature. And they take this amount, and because of differences between rodents and humans and how we metabolize certain things, they multiply that level by 100, and then they derive the acceptable daily intake on that multiplication factor of 100 times, right? So you could even argue, if you wanted to, that even if someone goes above the acceptable daily intake, you probably still wouldn't be at risk because they factored in this safety factor of 100-fold, which I think is very important to understand as well, is that there have already been safety measures and a margin of error included into these values. So obviously I hope no one is getting close to that acceptable daily intake of non-sugar sweeteners, because we should be having other kind of drinks and water and things, right? But it's just trying to reiterate the point that there is a massive room, there is a large margin of error to account for, and to perhaps not be concerned too much with these values that are put into place, because these values are put into place to reassure the consumer that you have to have a ridiculous amount every single day to perhaps be at risk, right?
Yeah, I think kind of on the flip side of that, whilst that's really reassuring that the individual ingredients are not a risk or are safe within those limits, I think what it doesn't account for is, if you were to eat or consume that amount, what are you then missing from your diet? Because what is it substituting? If you're consuming products, to that limit, you're probably then not getting enough whole foods, and it's probably kind of a substitution. And I think that's where there's a blurred line with that, because we should be consuming these things in moderation, in one way to free up room in our diet to consume the food that have really nutritious value.
Yeah, so this then ties nicely into the, where do ultra processed have a place in our dietary pattern as a whole? And if the majority of your dietary pattern is, comprised of minimally processed, nutritious, low calorie, voluminous foods that, will satiate you and have lots of nutrients, vitamins, minerals, then the utility of these products can be in the remaining part of your diet. I think that's a good place to wrap up there, touching on ultra processed foods. thank you very much for having this conversation with me.
Thank you for having me on.
Fantastic. Thank you.